Welcome to another episode of the Countdown of MonteCristo. Sorry for the break last week, but everybody was off for Lunar New Year, which is why this is going to be a very short episode, because we don't have a lot of the major leagues, the Asian leagues, in action because of the holidays out here. So without further ado, let's do the countdown. We only have 4 games this week, but it's going to be very interesting. And the theme of this week is looking at why the top teams in each region lost, and trying to break that down very briefly and take a look at what we might have as some of the teams that were on a high win rate. Of course, all 4 of the top 2 teams in each region. So the top 2 teams in each region in NA and EU all lost pretty convincingly, at least one game in the last week. So we're going to be talking about their losses and why that happened, and looking out a little bit for the future. So the games this week, let's go number 4, Fnatic versus Gambit. Number 3, TSM versus Team Liquid. Number 2, CLG versus C9. And number 1, SK versus Fnatic. So that ends the spoiler-free section. VODs are below if you want to check those games out. So we're going to start actually talking about the games now, so turn it off if you don't want those spoilers. Okay, so number 4 is going to be Fnatic versus Gambit. Now, Fnatic, one of the top teams in Europe, has had a very strong run so far, but I think that Gambit is finally started to figure out a few of their weaknesses. First off, I love Gambit's bans in this game, taking out the Rumble, Lissandra, and the Rengar, which have been so strong for Huni and Reignover. And why I think this is important is because Fnatic plays a very skirmish-based playstyle, that a lot of their victories come from getting Huni ahead on these high teamfight impact mages who can also skirmish. And so by denying those, I think Gambit really gave themselves a leg up, along with also going into some pretty heavy teamfight dominance with champions like Kennen and Lissandra and Morgana. There's a lot of AoE, a lot of CC here. So by forcing Huni onto a tank and Reignover onto this pretty suboptimal jungle pick in Olaf, I think they gave themselves a lot of tools to work with to kind of just hit R and win team fights. And also, one of Fnatic's weaknesses that we've seen this season has been that they overplay advantages in a pretty dangerous manner. And this game's number 4 because the early game was pretty sloppy. I mean, Diamond Prox did get killed while trying to invade the jungle, but then Huni and Reignover got killed at the red buff, and they were trying to play onto the strong side, meaning the side with Pinoy and Edward, the AD carry and support, in a lane swap situation. And that is just a ridiculously dangerous invade, and they rightfully got punished for it. And kind of my thing has been, yes, Fnatic's a very strong skirmish team. They remind me a lot of how the KT Arrows used to play, looking for these little fights and to win out in some of these lane situations and snowball that into a victory. But in this game, like the KT Arrows, they're also way too aggressive. Now, sometimes you can catch your opponent off guard, like with these kind of moves, but a lot of the time also it can backfire on you, and you end up giving up a lot for a very little reward. So I'm still a bit concerned in Fnatic. Yes, they have that ability to outplay, but I think with the right bans and the right draft in general, teams will be able to start abusing their over-aggression more by denying them picks that are really effective in the early and mid-game, which I think they've been relying on a bit too heavily. So we'll have to see if they adapt to overcome this weakness, or if they kind of keep going and normalize a little bit, probably a little bit further from the top of the rankings, but still probably top 50%. I also think that this is an interesting game because Gambit really kind of got back into it even with a sub. So they had some good teleport play, especially from Kabashard here, which I like, and it's fun to see Kennen back in the meta, that's for sure. So let's move on to number 3, which will be TSM versus Team Liquid. So TSM, we saw this in the previous week as well when they faced CLG. They actually have pretty poor early objective control, especially at Dragon. So they're giving up a lot of Dragons early, and they're frequently not grouping fast enough. And even though they are a very good team-fighting team, they're being forced to team-fight at suboptimal times because their side wave control is so poor. And that's really what I want, if you go back and watch this VOD, what you should take a look at here, is it's not a lot of the dragon fights were actually forced because of large minion waves pushes in top and bottom, because TSM was doing a very poor job of making sure that their lanes were pushing outwards. So they had to engage, otherwise basically Team Liquid could have just danced around those objectives forever. And then also caused TSM to take a lot of tower damage, possibly even losing their towers in the mid and late game. So TSM still has strong team fighting when they can actually do it optimally, which is what we saw in the late game. Of course, we saw Wild Turtle getting a penta right there. So the issue with TSM, though, remains that Bjergsen is still pretty much the only carry threat. And I know a lot of people are still going to get mad and say, well, Wild Turtle had a penta, Wild Turtle played those late game team fights really well. Well, really, if we actually go back and look at those team fights inside the base, Team Liquid is blowing like all their cooldowns on Bjergsen's Cassiopeia, and Wild Turtle's just playing cleanup with Jinx, which I think is a great champion for him. And it's not bad to be a more supportive style AD carry. In fact, we could see the same thing happening with SK Telecom. Frequently, Bang on SK Telecom has very big games and gets huge multi-kills on reset champions like Tristana because everybody just dumps all their cooldowns onto Faker. So I think this is a good way to play around Wild Turtle's strengths. But the difference here, and what's disconcerting about Wild Turtle, is that he flashes forward at very poor times often, and he'll make poor trades. In this game in particular, there was a team fight in the mid lane where he flashed forward for a kill onto Keith's Corki, and then immediately gave up shutdown gold off of that. And so TSM, Bjergsen didn't get behind this game. He just never got ahead. He went kind of even, had some assists, but didn't get too many kills on the Cassiopeia. And then Turtle, who had the kills, was playing overly aggressively and actually giving up more gold than he was gaining for his team in these kind of flash forward trades. So he needs to, I think, decide to play more conservatively. Like Bang doesn't usually make those kind of moves, and I think that's what's good about his play style, is that he waits for the right opportunity instead of trying to make it himself, which if TSM wants to be even more successful than they are in team fighting right now, I think that that's going to be key right here. On the other hand, Team Liquid, they did play well this game, but TL seems to live and die based off of Dominate's presence in the early and mid game. If he doesn't have a very strong early and mid game, and they did set up some really nice teleport plays with Quas right here and some good dives, Team Liquid doesn't seem to be able to do anything. So I'm concerned about TL's ability to play from behind, and I think this continues to show that TSM really needs to work on side wave control so that they can have more leisure when fighting at objectives like Dragon and not get it continually taken away from them, as well as Wild Turtle fixing some of the positioning issues that he's having right now and just playing more conservatively in general. So let us discuss CLG versus Cloud9. This game is interesting. Obviously, CLG has done pretty well so far this season, and Cloud9 has picked it up after pretty poor play in the first couple weeks. And even though they were very successful at IEM San Jose, I would say they didn't play very well there either in their last kind of major tournament. And a lot of that was because they had pretty poor engage, and I think Balls' team fighting was pretty off. But in this game, we really see Balls' team fighting coming back. Of course, Rumble's always been one of his best champions, but his equalizers and his engages, especially with Meteos Elimination, were really on point. And I think that was the big difference here, because when we look at this game, it's very interesting because both teams are so tactical in the early game. CLG and Cloud9, very good at early game rotations, securing objectives. We saw CLG jump out to that major Dragon League last week against TSM. But CLG, when Afro can't engage, when he can't land a bind or a hook, CLG's engage is very poor. When we saw their team fighting against TSM, it was like Link making questionable engages. In this game, Zion Spartan and Smithy the flank play wasn't really working at all. They were very discombobulated in how they engaged team fights. And in general, CLG's team fighting is not very good right now. And I think that was the big difference maker, is that while CLG and C9 both had some really strong early game objective play, and they did a good job of trading with each other, where it really broke open was Cloud9 having significantly better team fighting and abusing the mid-game power spike. CLG was trying to play against a Rumble quirky Zed comp by trying to fight mid-game at Dragon when they could have just farmed up, tried to take some towers, and then have Maokai become an unkillable monster. I mean, their front line was absolutely massive, and Maokai, Ahri, and Sivir are going to do much more in the late game. So for me, CLG, we look at this game, is Cloud9 back on the rise again? I mean, we kind of knew this was going to happen. They were too just consistent and too good to stay down where they were at the beginning of the season, and they're still going to be a major contender in the playoffs by the time everything rolls around, because they're now showing that they're equal with CLG in terms of those early game objectives, except that they have better team fighting and a better knowledge of power spikes. So CLG just needs to really evaluate team composition versus team composition and decide when they're going to be powerful. And also, they really need to work on their engages, because if Aframu can't make a play, CLG cannot team fight at all. And that is a pretty huge flaw in their play right now. They're not really going to have an issue against lower tier teams because they'll simply be able to outsmart them on the map. But against top competition, this is going to be a pretty massive issue, as we've seen up against both C9 and TSM in the last 2 weeks. So let's move on to our last game. Oops. Move this up here. There we go. Good enough. Okay, so Fnatic versus SK. This game was actually very interesting, and why I wanted this to be number one, the number one game of the week, is not only because SK, them losing is a pretty momentous occasion, because they hadn't lost yet up until this point, and because they had looked so strong in general, and finally somebody was able to figure out how to abuse their vision. I really enjoyed Deficio's casting in this game. I think he really hit the nail on the head when he talked about the 1-3-1 SK strategy and the Zed counterpick that Fnatic used just so they could have the strongest duelist in the game. And so by prioritizing that Zed pick, I really think that they had a very good game plan coming in. So the way SK plays, and the way they played last season too, except they're just better at it now because they have better players, is that they just push all the lanes. They pick for lane bully champions, then they push all the lanes, and then Svenskeren has the freedom to walk into the enemy jungle and duel the enemy jungler without fear of a collapse from the lanes. Now, the problem with this strategy is that when Svenskeren is in the early game and when he's in his own jungle, and SK typically under wards, they don't have wards, and the enemy jungler ganks, and Svenskeren's not counter jungling or can't react, then it's pretty free to get some of these early kills. And I think SK probably needs to break away from this strategy a little bit, or at least decide they need to be more coordinated about who's pushing depending on where Svenskeren is, instead of everybody just pushing all the time, because it creates problems like we saw the first blood on Freddy, which Freddy should have been playing further back right there, especially when you have a team composition where Svenskeren's on Jarvan and you're playing Redectin into Rumble. If that Rumble overextends, he's dead. He's just dead. There's too much CC there. So it puts a lot of pressure on your opponents, and I think that teams that don't have good shot calling tend to crack under that pressure and panic a little bit and not know what to do. But against good teams who do know what to do, and Fnatic really exploited what they were seeing pretty beautifully in this game. Another problem with the underwarding that I don't think has been brought up very much is that it also causes problems for Freddy to have locations to teleport to. Because pretty critically in this game, Huni had a lot more freedom to TP, and when they were making plays in the river or in the jungle, Huni would have wards to teleport onto, and Freddy would have nowhere to go. So basically, he couldn't even follow in TP if it was out of lane. And so that created some pretty big early advantages for the main carries of Fnatic, who are Huni and Fabivin. Steelback is a good AD carry, but he's much more of a cleanup style AD than anything else. So SK, they've really got to figure out this warding problem that they're having right now. They have to apply pressure, I think, a little bit more intelligently, because otherwise teams are going to just start mimicking Fnatic. And when you play like that and you force them into skirmishes and man advantages because you just have those teleports, it's going to be pretty effective. So I anticipate we'll probably see the best counterplay to this is just to invade Svenskerin's jungle, and if you see him there, drop a ward and have your top laner TP, because there's not going to be a whole lot of response to that, or try and force fights in the river. So that is going to be it for this week. Of course, we will be getting the Korean and Chinese and Taiwanese games all back up again in the following week, so we can have a longer countdown in 7 days' time. All right, guys, thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you next week.